All right, it's 6 o'clock, and we are going to begin. Good evening. I am Roddran Grimes, and I'm an assistant professor of special education in the College of Education. And I would like to welcome you to our Constitution Week event. I have the honor of moderating tonight's session on COVID and the health of democracy. Our distinguished panel will answer prepared questions regarding the Constitution and COVID, and then you, the audience, will have an opportunity to ask them questions. By means of introduction, our first panelist, Dr. Childre, is the Director of Student Health Services at Georgia College. She graduated from Georgia Southern with a Bachelor of Science in Health Science and went on to obtain her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from our institution here, and later received her family nurse practitioner from Walden University. She recently obtained her doctorate in nursing practice from Georgia College. Dr. Nicholas Creel is currently an assistant professor of business law at Georgia College. His research interests include religion and politics, international law, and constitutional law. His academic accomplishments include a recently completed PhD in political science from Texas Tech University, a Juris Doctor from the University of Dayton, and an LLM in International and Comparative Law from St. Mary's University. Paige Pate is an accomplished trial lawyer with over 25 years of experience in criminal defense and civil litigation. He has a national practice and has represented people in federal district and circuit courts all over the country. He has also helped resolve international legal disputes in Great Britain, Ireland, the Bahamas, and Spain. Attorney Pate has been named to the list of super lawyers for the past 12 consecutive years. And he is also listed as one of the best lawyers in America by the U.S. News. And last but certainly not least, Gene Strawn is the professor and director of Justice Studies program at Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho. He has won numerous awards for teaching such courses as American National Politics, State and Local Government, Law, and Society. He has taught and coached undergraduate mock trial and moot court teams, and he has served as an agency program evaluator for community prosecution and law enforcement grants. So, I'd like to now begin our question and answer session. To Dr. Strawn, how did the Founding Fathers deal with the use of government authority to control the spread of infectious illnesses?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the interesting things that we've heard politicians lately ask kind of rhetorically or sarcastically is, would the founders, George Washington in particular, would he endorse quarantines, vaccinations, travel bans, and mask mandates? And those are some interesting questions in constitutional law, because a lot of times we interpret the Constitution, the scope of government authority, the nature of the protection of constitutional rights according to the original intentions of those people who adopted the Constitution. So I think looking at early American history is really useful for this discussion, but we've got to condense it into about 300 years have to be condensed into a few minutes. So let me start off by saying that early America was plagued by infectious diseases, especially yellow fever, smallpox, malaria, diphtheria, and other sorts of illnesses. Yellow fever emerged first in America in 1668 in Philadelphia, caused thousands of deaths. It was brought over from Barbados, the Caribbean islands. It was transmitted by mosquitoes, infecting persons oftentimes with literally thousands of doses that would span over their entire lifetime. Throughout the colonial period, there were yellow fever outbreaks in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, New Hampshire, Florida, Texas, and all the way up the Mississippi River to St. Louis. During many of these epidemics, the residents would shut themselves in their houses away from friends and jobs. Public officials regularly enforced quarantines and travel bans. In 1793, the United States Capitol, when it was in Philadelphia, had a yellow fever outbreak, and the entire federal government shut down, with most of the public officials leaving the capital city. In 1796, in response to a deadly yellow fever outbreak, the Third Congress passed the first federal quarantine law, which was actually signed by President Washington. It authorized the federal government to help the states to enforce quarantines as necessary to maintain public health. The other infectious illness that plagued North America was smallpox. And it was a problem for hundreds of years. It was caused by the variola virus, and it was spread by physical contact. Smallpox was highly contagious, disfiguring, and often deadly. In 18th century Europe, about 400,000 people died from smallpox per year. When Europeans came over to North America, they brought smallpox with them and wiped out about 95% of the Native American population. From 1636 to 1698, Boston alone endured 6 smallpox epidemics. In 1721, the city had 5,759 reported smallpox cases out of about 10,600 people, with about 844 deaths. The colonists tried to prevent the spread of smallpox by isolation and other rather crude and unscientific practices like bloodletting. The Boston outbreak motivated Puritan minister Cotton Mather and Harvard physician Zabdiel Boylston to variolate hundreds of Bostonians as part of the early experiment with public inoculation. Many of the colonists were against inoculation. It involved in introducing infected materials into the body of healthy persons so that they would contract a mild form of smallpox, recover, and become immune to the infection. Most of the colonists were wary of this new medical procedure. They really thought it was counterintuitive. Why would we infect a healthy body with smallpox? Because that's not only dangerous to the individual, but it's dangerous to the community because it could allow the spread of smallpox. So most people, of course, refused inoculation. And some of the people who were inoculated at the time even died. Another outbreak of smallpox occurred, and this is a very important one, during the American Revolutionary War. It posed a major threat to the Continental Army led by General George Washington. And when George Washington and his troops sieged Boston, the disease had broke out not only among British troops, but also the Continental Army. Smallpox itself spread during this time to Texas, New Orleans. It crossed the Great Plains. It reached as far as the Pacific coast and as far as north as Alaska and as far as south as Mexico. It is estimated that smallpox during this time killed 11,000 Native Americans in the western area of present-day Washington. So it was a tremendous problem all the way across North America. Back to the American Revolution, Washington worked hard to contain the smallpox epidemic himself by isolating anyone and quarantining any place of infection. After the British Army left Boston, he would only allow his soldiers to go into the city who had already been exposed to smallpox in order to protect his troops. And you have to remember, he didn't have the size of troops that the British Army did, so he was really concerned about what smallpox could do to the United States Army. Initially, George Washington was reluctant to inoculate his own troops, but as many of his troops fell victim to smallpox and he became very concerned about being able to win the war against Great Britain, he started to change his mind. And he came to realize that quarantines and travel bans were enough. Also, his wife, Martha Washington, got inoculated herself. And George Washington came to realize the danger that smallpox posed to his troops and even the outcome of the war itself. So he decided to have his entire troops inoculated. He said, necessity not only authorizes, but seems to require the measure. For should the disorder infect the army, should smallpox infect the army, we should have more to dread from it than from the sword of the enemy. Many of the leading figures of the American Revolution were involved in the effort to stop the spread of infectious disease throughout the newly formed states. People like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, among others, came to realize that things like quarantines and even inoculations were necessary. John and Abigail Adams likewise inoculated themselves and their 4 children, and this set a very powerful example for other wealthy, well-educated families within early America.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much. So that was a wonderful history on the Founding Fathers' impact on the control of infectious disease. Does any of our other panelists have anything to add to that?
I mean, sure. I mean, if anything else, I would just go ahead and point out the fact that, I mean, the Founding Fathers were generally pretty well-studied men. Like, these were guys who were men of science. It's just science wasn't that far yet. And so with inoculation being kind of like you were saying, a kind of a newer thing at the time, they still embraced it because that seemed to be what the evidence indicated was the best option forward. And so asking now, if we were to put them today and, show here's how far science has come on the issue, it just seems extremely difficult for me to believe anything other than the fact that they would have probably embraced these very warmly, looking at how open they were to it at the time. When the smallpox vaccine itself, that form of inoculation was a tough thing to go through very often. So it just, to me, it seems like it only bolsters the case if you're trying to look at from an original intent angle.
Thank you. Do any other panelists want to add?
I was just going to say, I like the use of the word, it was a necessity, because sometimes things are just a necessity. Sometimes we have to move beyond what we feel like might be just personal, but sometimes there's things that just need to be done out of necessity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Attorney Pate?
Yes, I would also have to agree that saying a word like necessity carries a lot of legal and constitutional meaning as well. There is a necessary and proper clause in the Constitution that allows the federal government to put in place laws and regulations that are necessary to carry out their enumerated powers. And listening to the history lesson and understanding how important the protection of the troops and early Americans were from this disease, or that disease at the time, I think we can see even back then, they realized that this type of action would be necessary and proper to promote general welfare.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and the one thing that I'd add to this too is that when you look at what the founders did, they obviously adopted strict measures of isolation, quarantines, and inoculations to stifle the spread of infectious diseases based on the medical science of their time. And I think they understood the words of Benjamin Franklin very well, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And when you look at some of the things that the founders were willing to support in order to maintain public health, it kind of gives you a different version of the very scope of constitutional rights to resist that sort of thing.
Thank you. All right, our second question is, and this is to Dr. Creel to start off, can the federal government require masks or vaccines nationwide?
Yeah, so this is actually one that, I'm going to take this off for a minute. Asking about required masks, and I take one off. So this is one we're actually going to find out pretty soon, right? Most of you guys have probably heard by now the Biden vaccine mandate that's going to go through. Now, one thing to point out, though, is that is not literally to everybody. That's not going to be to all 345 million Americans. If you look at the details of it, it's actually a targeted one. And I think that's because it has to be. I don't think at the end of the day, as much as we might look at it and say it's potentially necessary, I still just don't think the federal government has that power. And a lot of that comes from the fact that they are a government of enumerated powers. When the federal government wants to do something, they've got to grab the Constitution and say, here's where I can do it. So yeah, they could potentially, the necessary and proper clause is one that they could look to and potentially get. And in times of emergency, courts are very deferential. But, is the court, by the time they get a challenge to this thing, we might be on the other side of the pandemic. God, I hope by then. And so it just may be one of those things where they're not as willing to give it, the power there. You could also argue maybe the Commerce Clause, which has been one that we've often used to expand federal government power, because of, that's something we can all look at and see. This pandemic has wrecked our economy pretty massively. And a lot of it was, self-inflicted. When we went to these shutdowns, we decided we would take that economic hit in order to do something that we believed was for the greater good. But that too, we're not so sure that we're currently dealing with a court that is likely to give that big of a reading to the Commerce Clause. The current court is very likely to look at it and probably think it's time to hem that in a bit. We saw this when they reviewed the Obamacare case, looking at it, and they were saying you can't regulate inactivity. That was the key that we got from it. And so if you tried to justify mandating a vaccine with the Commerce Clause, you would essentially then be regulating inactivity, not getting the vaccine. And so under the logic of the case that, is the most relevant that I can think of for the federal government using the Commerce Clause, again, I just don't think they're going to have the ability to push it there. Now, that said, the executive can make law or regulations, as we call them, through administrative law. And that is a way where I think we will see, it's more likely than not, the Biden vaccine mandate is going to be held as constitutional. So if you work for an employer that has 100 or more employees, odds are you will be forced to get that vaccine. You will be mandated to get it. And the reason for that is Congress can go ahead and give the executive the authority to go and create some of these regulations. They can go kind of fill in the blanks of law. And using what they did to create the OSHA, the government agency OSHA, which more or less is to keep us all safe at work, that's a pretty powerful law that was created and given over to the executive. And so he could probably do that on there. And it's, again, it will be challenged. And we are living in interesting times, and that we get to see the development of con law happening a lot more rapidly than I think a lot of other periods of history. But even then, we're not really sure yet. But most likely, yes, in a targeted manner, but most likely not to everybody.
Thank you. Do any other panelists have anything to add?
I would actually think that the federal government will have the authority if they want to enact very broad vaccine mandates. And I think the Commerce Clause is where they'll look. What's happening now with the Biden administration trying to do this emergency regulation through OSHA is an attempt for the executive to say, well, we can do this without congressional authority. You've heard a lot of people want to challenge that. You've got 20 some odd state attorneys general writing the Biden administration saying we're going to challenge that. Our governor here in Georgia said we're going to challenge that, but there hasn't been a legal challenge filed to that yet. And I think that's because OSHA has very broad power and discretion in putting forth regulations like this when they directly affect public health and safety. And I think that's the same argument if Congress wanted to step in and enact an actual law that went broader, went further than the OSHA regulation. They would rely on the Commerce Clause. I think this does affect not just inactivity, but the ability of people to go from state to state, commerce to go from state to state, air travel. All of that has to do directly with interstate commerce, and I think would give a foundation for Congress to do something here. But I also agree that it is correct. This current Supreme Court is very protective of states' rights. And so I think it would be much easier for a state-by-state vaccine mandate to be found constitutional than a national one.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. We know already states can mandate vaccines. We do all the time. Any of you guys went to public school, K through 12, you had your vaccine passport every time you went and registered for the beginning of the year to show the whole host of vaccines you have. Even here at Georgia College, we make you guys prove you have, I think, measles, mumps, rubella. I don't think we do meningitis here, but that's one that's pretty common at a lot of universities. And we had a case in 1905, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, where a guy said, look, I've had bad reactions to vaccines in the past. I don't want to get another one. Well, they said, too bad. The law says everybody's got to get it or you pay a $5 fine. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, Massachusetts has the right to make you get it, even if you think it's going to hurt you. So he had to pay the fine. It would be the equivalent today of paying like a $500 fine I think it was adjusted for inflation. So states, there's almost no real argument. States can absolutely require it because they have what we call police powers under the 10th Amendment. They can regulate the health, safety, and welfare of their people. And that's something that again, because I think this current court is, a 6-3 conservative majority that is looking to expand states' rights. I definitely think they're going to be the ones who try to maybe say, if the states had done it, we'd been okay with this. But the federal government doing a broad mandate, I have a hard time politically buying that they would put the law in that way.
All right, thank you. All right, moving on to the third question. To Attorney Pate, how can the Constitution be interpreted regarding the public health needs of the many versus an individual's choice regarding his or her own body? And how can these viewpoints be balanced?
Well, I think we've already talked a little bit about that, and there is a balance that's required here. I mean, the Constitution is fairly specific as far as the powers that the federal government has, and then the rights that are reserved to both the states and the individuals that we see in the Bill of Rights. So I think when we're looking at something as serious as a pandemic like COVID-19 and the willingness, at least in some parts of the government, to enact something that's very broad to protect public health, we can look at the Constitution and find in those enumerated powers that are specifically given to the federal government the ability to regulate commerce, we've discussed that, the ability and the obligation to provide for the general welfare, to protect people in the United States, to provide for armies and navies. I mean, we heard already from Dr. Strawn how important it was back during the Revolutionary War times to the health and safety of our troops. And that is certainly an obligation and a responsibility that Congress has under the Constitution. So I think the Constitution does provide a basis for the government to enact measures that are directed towards public health. But yes, they do have to be balanced with individual rights and also balanced with states' rights. So I think the discussion we've had about whether a state has the clearest ground to enact a vaccine mandate here versus the federal government, I think that's right. I think that's true. And an individual's right, both to liberty interest, which can be certainly inconvenienced or encumbered by vaccine mandates. I think in certain situations like this, as long as it's directed towards public health and rationally enacted in a limited way, I think those rights will be outweighed in the context of what we're dealing with right now.
Thank you. Other panelists, what say you? All right, well, we will move on to the fourth question then. Dr. Childre, what can the federal government do to entice people to get a vaccine? For example, here at Georgia College, we've implemented a federally funded incentive program. So what can we do?
Yeah, that's right. And that is a good example and probably the one that I'm most familiar with. But just to talk about the incentives just a little bit, it goes back to the CARES Act that was created by the federal government back in March of 2020. This is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act that was put together. It was like a $2.2 trillion to provide fast, direct help, if you will, relief to the American people who have been negatively impacted by COVID-19. So you've got this money that's been allotted, and I want to break it down more to what I'm more familiar with, which is at Georgia College. So part of that $2.2 trillion, you've got approximately like 14 billion of that was put towards education, which is called a different fund. We call it HERF, but that stands for Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. So that's the money that we here at Georgia College have been allotted and are using for our incentive program. So the incentives can be used in multiple different ways, and it's up to states or schools or whoever to decide how they want to use their incentives. We chose here to use, like, we're given, if you haven't heard, we're given $50 cash if you get your vaccine, if you have not been vaccinated, and that's for each vaccine. But it could be, some people might choose to do dining dollars, gift cards, straight out gift cards. Some people might get straight out cash. All these would be considered incentives towards that. So there's no right or wrong. But there are rules that go around that. There are certain guidelines that if your institution, such as Georgia College, chooses to provide this incentive, that we have certain rules that the federal government sets that we must follow. The main thing is that the incentives need to be expected to increase the number of people who choose to get vaccinated. So that's the whole point, is to motivate people to get vaccinated sooner than they otherwise would. And that's what an incentive is, right? It's something that'll make you want to do something before maybe you really were ready to do it. So if money is how that makes you get that done, then money it is. And so that's what the federal government has set aside, and there's certain amounts of money for that. And so that's what we're using here to do that. There are other things that have to kind of, you can't obviously, or it may or may not be obvious, but some of the other federal rules are, it has to be the program that you decide to do, it has to be a legally allowable incentive. And I'm sure our lawyers on the panel could probably elaborate more on that. But to put it basic, because I'm a little more basic on that, is, you couldn't offer alcohol or something like that for an incentive. It has to be something that's within legal bounds. And then other things, of course, it would have to be, currently enrolled students or faculty. You couldn't use the incentive to entice people to come to your institution. You couldn't say, oh, I'm going to pay you this money to come. So there's rules around it all to make that work. And then some of the state things, you may have heard states that might have a lottery or some form like that, or drawings for cash or drawings for electronics. These are all forms of incentives that we see and things that are happening. So that's just kind of a little tip of the iceberg. I know we're limited on time, but perhaps some of our other panelists might want to add to some of the more rules that the federal government has on some of those incentives.
Well, thank you. Yes, indeed. Other panelists, anyone want to add to that as far as incentive programs?
Yeah, real quick, I was going to say, one thing we've been talking a lot about now are all carrots, right? With incentives, you can offer carrots, which is basically bribes. You try to give them that. Well, you can also use what we call sticks. An incentive, right, it spurs you into action, but it doesn't have to be because of a good thing. It could be because you don't want to face some sort of a negative consequence. So one thing I'm almost a little surprised at is we didn't use a power that we know the federal government has, absolutely, the power to tax, right? So whenever we could have set it to where when you go file your taxes this coming April, you get a $2,000 credit if you did get the vaccine, and you have to pay an additional 2% surtax on your income if you didn't on there. And that's something that would have almost absolutely been completely constitutional for them to have done on there. So that would have been a pretty excellent mix of a carrot and stick that they could have.
Now that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even just have insurance companies tell them, jack up the rates. For anybody who doesn't, get it, go ahead and double their premium. That's something they could have given under law. They could have given them the ability to discriminate based on vaccination status, and that would have flown.
Anyone else? Attorney Pate, Dr. Strawn?
Well, I think that's an excellent idea that's brought up. Of course, we understand the politics of that, right? I mean, you have parties that just simply don't want to take a position because they're too afraid to exercise political courage and principles because they might lose some votes in the process.
Anything else? All right. Well, we shall move on to the fifth question. So to Dr. Strawn, What has the Supreme Court said about the power of government to enforce quarantines and vaccinations?
All right, well, there's several decisions out there, and many of them are rather old. So I thought I would go through some of the different ones as quickly as I can. One of the first ones is Compagnie Française de Navigation au Vapeur versus the Board of Louisiana in 1902. And what had happened is you had a ship, the SS Britannia, it sailed from Italy to France and then over to New Orleans. And the port of authorities in New Orleans would not allow the ship in, even though the ship had checked out at a checkpoint and didn't have any sort of issues with yellow fever or other infectious diseases, because New Orleans had essentially declared a quarantine because they had a yellow fever outbreak. And New Orleans had experienced quite a few of these. And so the ship was sent back, and it had to go back to Florida, drop off the passengers, and then come back to New Orleans and drop off the cargo. And the ship company sued the Board of Health of Louisiana and the state of Louisiana, and it made the argument that the state didn't have the police power consistent with the Commerce Clause, because this was a federal issue, and they shouldn't have been imposing quarantines on a ship that didn't have any sort of infectious people on the ship. And they also claimed that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state of Louisiana. It said that states have the police power consistent with the Commerce Clause, as long as the federal government hasn't preempted its authority to impose quarantines when it has situations of yellow fever. After all, that's a public health concern, and states have the authority to, protect the public health and impose quarantines. So that was an early precedent, the Compagnie Française case, 1902, that established the power of quarantines. As was already brought up, Jacobson versus Massachusetts is a 1905 case that dealt with, of course, smallpox epidemic and breakouts in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts was one of 11 states at this time that had passed a state law requiring vaccinations of the residents of their cities if the Board of Health of those cities wanted to impose that requirement. So Cambridge required its residents to be vaccinated and re vaccinated if they had already had the vaccination in the past. And Hennings Jacobs, he's a Lutheran minister, and he is from Sweden, and he objects to the vaccination, and his argument that is it interferes with his freedom, his liberty. He argues it's oppressive, it's arbitrary, and it violates his rights under the 14th Amendment. And he had also claimed that when he was in Sweden, he and his son had had an adverse reaction to the vaccine. So the Supreme Court takes a look at this case, and it, talks about the importance of freedom and liberty, and then it discusses how people's freedom and their liberty is not absolute. And I'm going to read you a part from this opinion. It says, the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States to every person does not import an absolute right in each person to be, and at all times and in all circumstances, wholly freed from restraint. There are manifold restraints which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. On any other basis, organized society could not exist with safety to its members. Society based on the rule that each one is a law unto himself would soon be confronted with disorder and anarchy. Real liberty for all could not exist under the operation of a principle which recognizes the right of each individual to use his own, whether in respect of his person or his property, regardless of the injury that he may be doing to others. And so the Supreme Court found that the states certainly have the police powers, again, under the 10th Amendment, to protect the health and the welfare of the community. And the court kind of used what we would call a modern day ends and means analysis. It said that essentially Massachusetts and the city of Cambridge had a paramount necessity to prevent the smallpox epidemic from growing. And at the time, the disease was spreading exponentially. It said that that the government, the state, has to select a means that has some real or substantial relationship to the ends of protection of the public health from the smallpox epidemic. So this real or substantial relationship to the concern that government has, the court emphasized, and it concluded that there was a reasonable means because the vaccine at this time was over 100 years old and it was very effective. And when Jacobson brought up the fact that, well, there's differing opinions in terms of the efficacy of the vaccine, the court ruled essentially that the medical community was saying that the vaccine was safe. And even where there is differing opinions, the court emphasized that deference should be paid to the legislature. I also want to emphasize what was brought up before, that no one was actually forced to take the vaccine, not even Jacobson and the other 5 people who were convicted of violating the statute, but they had to pay a $5 fine. The next case I'd like to bring up is Zutch versus King in 1922. And this is where the San Antonio School District imposed vaccination requirements on public school students and private school students. And Rosanna Zutch actually files an action that this violates her 14th Amendment rights to require her to go and get a vaccine, particularly because San Antonio at the time had not had an outbreak of the smallpox. Well, the court, I will point out that in the country at the time in the 1920s, there was another outbreak of smallpox, but it really hadn't hit San Antonio, Texas. And the court, again, cited Jacobson, and it also cited the broad deference given to states to deal with, outbreaks or even potential outbreaks. And it used kind of a rational basis standard where it said, what we're ultimately going to ask is whether this is, a reasonable thing, a rational thing to do to prevent the spreading of smallpox, which obviously states, again, have the police powers to protect their public health. And of course, we recently got a case that was decided by the Seventh Circuit, Clausen versus Indiana University in 2021, where students were required to have a vaccination. And if they didn't get a vaccination for a religious or a medical exemption, then they had to wear a mask and be tested twice a week. And there were 8 students who filed an action against Indiana University. The Seventh Circuit again cited Jacobson for the fact that states have the police power to do what they can to prevent the spread of illnesses, and Covet falls in those lines. The court also emphasized that students were given religious and medical exemptions and that most of the plaintiffs would have been exempted. And then the court emphasized how students are already subject to regulations in terms of having to pay tuition and other conditions in colleges and universities, like having to write papers and take exams that they may not want to. And it also pointed out that the students could go elsewhere if they didn't like the regulations. So in the Clausen case, again, the Seventh Circuit upheld mandatory vaccinations, if you want to call them that, for students at Indiana University. And as you know, the Supreme Court itself refused to grant certiorari to review that case. And I think I'll stop there because I'm out of time.
Okay, thank you. That was quite informative. And so, other panelists, what say you to add to this? I found that quite informative.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to bring up a part you had said on there that may not mean a lot to a lot of other people. When you use the term the rational basis test is what's used. This is legally basically saying it's a very low bar for the government to have to clear to use this power. So to use that police power to require vaccines, all it basically has to do is say it's rationally related. What I'm doing, mandating this vaccine, is rationally related to achieving this ends that I'm allowed to do. And that's it. So even if you use the whole like, oh, it's a new vaccine, it's a new technology, that's not going to win it. You're still going to lose because this is such a low bar for the government to clear.
Anyone else?
Can I comment to that?
Yes.
Okay, that's a really important point. One of the things that I didn't get to talk to just because I ran out of time, and I'll try to say this quickly. There is an argument, however, that the court should treat this as a fundamental right, because people do have a right to bodily autonomy and integrity. And if you treat it as a fundamental right, then you move from the rational basis test to the heightened strict scrutiny test. At that point, it says government has to have a compelling interest of the highest order, which is usually about regulating safety, rights, health, and welfare, which one can argue that it has. But it also has to use a narrowly tailored means, or the least drastic or the least restrictive alternative available to protecting our health against COVID. And the reason why I point this out is because I think the Seventh Circuit and other courts should really consider the importance and the advances we've had in constitutional law since 1905 and 1922 about bodily integrity and someone's right to refuse medical treatment. And there's several cases out there that kind of set this up, where I think we may have some courts that will elevate and exact more judicial scrutiny on these laws and practices if they treat it as a fundamental right. That doesn't mean that the government won't still win, by the way.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, question number 6 is directed to Dr. Creel. What sort of legal recourse is there for those who catch COVID on the job or at school or at a store where they're shopping? Essentially, can you sue an individual if it's their fault you got sick?
Yeah, this actually relates to some research Professor El-Jabaghi and I have just started taking up. And what we had noticed is she started looking at this research by looking at what states were passing COVID liability shields, essentially. So we're up to now 30 states have passed a law to where you basically cannot sue any institution, your employer or anything. They've passed a law saying you cannot sue them if you got contracted COVID on their premises. And while looking into it, one thing we had noticed when she was breaking down the law and was first presenting some of her research, we noticed already it's really hard to win these kinds of lawsuits in normal times, because you're usually going to have to rely on proving what we call as negligence. That's what you're suing on, is you were negligent. That's why you got sick, because you weren't taking these proper precautions. Well, the thing with negligence is there's this part of it that you have to prove, which is causation. You have to prove it's because of what you didn't do. The standards you didn't take is why I got sick. Well, with something like COVID, right, how can you really prove you got it at the job or anything else, right? This is microscopic. You can't see it. Maybe you went to go get some groceries or something. Maybe you caught it there. Maybe you said hello to somebody on the street, and who knows, 1 in a million chance you caught it there. There's so many other ways that you can basically, show you might have got it somewhere else. It's just really difficult to sue on. So a lot of these, the shield laws that were passed, 30 states, it's even harder now because of those shield laws. But even before that, it's just so difficult that it isn't really very likely to be something we'll see. And then the 20 states that haven't so far, we just haven't seen this outbreak of liability. We haven't seen this outbreak of lawsuits coming out, that seem to have justified passing those liability shields.
Any other panelists want to add to that?
Is Georgia one of those?
Georgia is
states?
one of those. In fact, we found out of the 30 states that did, they had one thing in common: a GOP legislature.
Oh.
If the Republican Party controlled the legislature of a state, it passed the COVID liability shield. If they didn't control both houses, then it did not get passed. The partisanship of the governor didn't matter. Nothing else. The amount of COVID in a state didn't matter. We ran the analysis, and the only thing that mattered was, did the Republican Party control it? And so it really, I think, illustrates the partisan nature of which we've kind of approached this pandemic. Based on where you live, the party that controls your state is going to dictate a lot of the policy you're dealing with, even though it's, a thing that we generally know what the scientific data tells us. The results from that are going to vary highly based on where you live.
Interesting. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating subject, and I think the causation issue is such a tremendous problem in a negligence lawsuit. I do wonder, are there exceptions made in any of these laws in terms of maybe someone does something at some point that the legislators haven't thought of, where they intentionally or maliciously or recklessly expose people to COVID? Because to me, that's such a different case, right? It's a different situation.
Yeah. Most of these just will deal with negligence, to where, you're
Okay.
excused from negligence, but intentional. It doesn't seem, most of them that I've seen don't go all the way out to where if somebody grabbed a box of COVID and threw it in your face, you'd still have a solid lawsuit on your hands.
Right.
But when it
Okay.
comes to just plain negligence, they basically elevated it to like gross negligence, was
Right.
the standard that you have to cross.
Anyone else before we close out this question? Okay. Well, the next question is directed to Attorney Pate. And we've talked about the Supreme Court and we've talked about the states. But this question is, can people sue businesses that require vaccines or businesses that require masks? And if so, are they likely to win?
Well, I'll give you the lawyer answer to the first part of that question. Yeah, you can sue anybody for anything. The idea of whether you're going to win or not and whether it's going to be cost effective, that's obviously another question. The short answer is no. A private business can certainly enact regulations, you would call them regulations, rules, policies that affect people that come into their establishment, people they do business with just a few exceptions. I mean, there are public accommodation laws, there are discrimination laws that obviously prevent a business from targeting a protected class. I mean, they cannot say a certain race or gender or disability cannot enter their store or their place of business. As we know, there are federal laws that protect against that type of discrimination and require a certain amount of accommodation, especially when we're dealing with disabilities. But as far as saying, you require a vaccine for me to go there, I'm going to sue you because I otherwise should be free to go into this establishment, that type of a lawsuit is not going to be successful. Now, the one thing that I think is smart for most of these businesses to avoid the potential for being liable on failing to reasonably accommodate someone with a medical disability who for medical reasons cannot take the vaccine or cannot have it administered to them, you got to have some sort of out, some sort of option. Say a restaurant. Well, okay, you don't want to take the vaccine. We're requiring it for all of our customers, but I'll tell you what, you can get your order to go. So we're giving you some sort of accommodation here. Maybe we have outdoor seating that's acceptable for someone who has a medical reason for not taking the vaccine. So I think a smart business will try to make an exception for medical reasons to avoid potential liability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But other than that, I don't see any successful cause of action against a business now.
Thank you. Do any other panelists have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually seen now, I think 2 or 3 hospital systems have groups of nurses and doctors who got fired because they didn't get the vaccine when their institution required it, and they're not winning. The courts are not siding with them on this one, and so I mean, the law does seem to be pretty clear on it that for the most part, if your employer makes you get it, you're going to have to get it or find a new employer.
Anyone else? Okay, moving on to question number 8. Dr. Childre, what is the role of public health in the COVID-19 pandemic from a rural and urban health perspective?
Okay. So public health in any time, whether we're talking about during a pandemic or not, their goal is to ensure that there is this delivery of an equitable health care to all communities. So whether it's rural, urban, they want to make sure that everybody's getting equal health care. But during a pandemic time, you just hear way more about that. These public health workers are just working hard all the time, like I said, pandemic or not, but there's been a lot of light brought to public health because of the pandemic. So what it maybe changes a little bit is where public health has to determine where to target the resources for the pandemic and maybe to try to get them where they're most needed. And as an example, I know a lot of our students come from maybe the Atlanta area. When you come to Milledgeville, you might quickly see that there's not an urgent care on every corner, or there might not be 3 different hospitals for you to choose to go to for your health care. There might not be primary care physicians just all everywhere. It's a little more limited even here in Milledgeville, but in our surrounding counties where it's even more rural, you're going to see less and less of the access to health care, where there's more poverty, there's more chronic illness due to the fact that maybe these people cannot get to the health care they need. This can lead to more fatal consequences for something like COVID in particular. It could be they're more uninsured, or just their access to get to the care is not there. So these are some problems maybe more in the rural that you may not think as much about if you're coming from more of the bigger city feel. But the public health role overall wants to make sure they're reaching these communities. Right now, the target is to get COVID testing out there to make sure anybody who wants to get tested can get tested. Anybody who wants to get the vaccine can get the vaccine. And we're going to them, we're reaching out to them and going into these communities and make sure that is happening. Even beyond that, you've got efforts that the public health is doing that goes on that you might hear about, but you might not realize how tedious it is, like contact tracing. This is something that people are working around the clock to do the contact tracing, do it in a timely manner. It is effective at reaching and keeping the pandemic to a minimal. Again, things like our public health, our community health centers, they are making sure that they have vaccine on hand, they have proper storage for it, and then, of course, delivery of it, getting it out, whether it means these drive-through clinics, walk-in clinics, anything to encourage people to get out there and do that, to get to those areas that need it. Telehealth visits, virtual visits, anything that can kind of make healthcare more accessible, particularly to these rural areas, is some of the jobs that our public health does. A few other things I just want to mention is not only to increase the accessibility and availability of testing and vaccines, but to also identify certain geographic regions that might be hotspots for the virus, where we really need to, again, focus the attention on. And that's something that public health is doing. They're targeting these resources to these areas. And then finally, I just want to mention something our community health centers, our public health is doing, is trying to reach out to the stakeholders of the communities, whether that's the hospitals, the healthcare centers, insurance providers, policymakers. All of them have to come together. It could be a community-based organization. It could be a faith-based organization. But all these people have to come together in the end to, when you're in something like a pandemic, to really be effective and be supportive in that community, and hopefully get the information out, get the appropriate information out, disseminate the information so that these communities can all be reached effectively.
Thank you so much. Other panelists, any other thoughts on this topic? Okay then, well, thank you. Our last prepared question before we turn the questioning over to you, our audience, is directed to Dr. Creel. What does the government's response to the pandemic say about the health of our democracy?
Well, I'm not tenured yet, so let me be a little careful on how I respond. In general, it's I think pretty obvious. It's not positive. Things aren't looking great based on this. We generally think our government should be pretty well equipped to handle with something, especially when we know what the right answer is. And yet we see that one of the biggest problems is not everybody believes it. We have this massive kind of misinformation campaign going on. So like a great example of that is like the ivermectin issue that we're seeing now. And this isn't me talking about like the human version that you can get prescribed you from a doctor. I'm talking about like if you go to a cattle or feed store to buy the actual like paste that's supposed to be apple flavored that you then give to a horse, like people are hoarding that and taking it for themselves on their own rather than trusting the government providing a vaccine that's now been given to close to what, like several 100 million people worldwide. They trust the horse paste over that. To the point where whenever we've reached that kind of a level, that shows just something is fundamentally broken within our society when you're that distrustful of it. And just almost at every turn, like when we take the COVID liability shield laws, almost everybody who's in a state legislator is a lawyer. They all look at this and they know when they pass this liability shield, it's worthless. It's not going to help anybody. That's why we're calling them showboat shields. It's basically just so they can say, hey, look what I did. It's worthless, but I did it. It was just to make a point. It wasn't to actually solve anything. And that's something that was 30 states who did that, which again is a little depressing when the government was more focused on let's make a political point than actually solving the problem that's now killed, 675,000 or so Americans? This is worse now than the Spanish flu in terms of total deaths. 1 in 500 Americans is dead, and we're not done yet. And so the fact that we're not focusing on some of these basic things, and the government's still just not achieving it all that well. You had spoken to testing, like getting testing out. We're the only developed country where you don't just have tests thrown at you, basically. In like the United Kingdom, I think you get 7 a week, just like given straight to your door per person in the household. And we're not focused on that because our government politically is kind of gridlocked. We're stuck in a position where even passing a bill, which would make that at the federal level to where every postman would deliver it, there's not enough political will to do that because we're so divided on something that should be a no-brainer. Let people get free tests. But so overall, it's not a positive outlook for the state of the nation as we've seen it, in response to this pandemic.
Yes,
I would add to this too. I think we're really bad at learning from our past history.
yes.
It almost seems like every so often, we need a history lesson. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but the Spanish flu, influenza, when that hit after World War I, did you know we led the country in wearing masks? I mean, we led the world in wearing masks. There were laws passed all over the United States. San Francisco passed an ordinance. People wore masks because the situation was bad enough that they realized, hey, we've got to do something to prevent the spread of this illness. And I'm sure politics entered into that picture, but nothing like it has now. And it's almost like we have this sort of false sense of health because we haven't gone through serious infectious illness situations, at least a couple of generations haven't, because of vaccinations and good health and probably some good luck too. And it's almost like it's not bad enough yet for us to once again have to experience another history lesson. Because the idea that politics enters public health, that's the one thing, the health of this nation, the ability to win the American Revolutionary War. And you think about how bad it was at that point. Politics should not enter into the equation of public health. It does, but I think we have to pay more attention to history. And I also think things probably have to get a little worse before people come together and realize that we need to do something to prevent, the threat of COVID to our modern day society.
Thank you. Thank you. Attorney Pate, Dr. Childre?
Well, I would certainly agree with all those comments. And I think it's particularly disturbing in this environment, not just to see the pushback on scientific reasons to address COVID-19, but the aggressive enactment of regulations and laws to prevent independent school districts from having vaccine mandates, preventing businesses from, trying to protect the health of their employees and customers. I don't think we've ever seen anything like that. I mean, I've been asked many times on the media about whether Governor Kemp can have an executive order that can affect what local school districts are doing in terms of addressing COVID-19? And the answer is generally the governor can do something like that when it's directed to protecting public health. But the motive here seems to be the opposite of that. I'm not going to let these districts do what they believe is necessary for public health. I mean, I'm no history professor, but I don't think we've ever seen anything like that before, and it is very disturbing.
Well, and I have to add this because the irony, of course, is the Republican Party is all about letting grassroots government and local government make decisions because they're closest to the people and in the best position to make decisions. Well, that's not true if it flies in the face of their political view of our current COVID situation.
Anything else to add about the health of our democracy? Yes, excellent, excellent discussion on these topics. So thank you so much. So, audience, if you have a question for our panelists, please line up to my right, your left, and you can ask the questions one by one at the microphone up front. So please feel free.
Don't everybody run down here at once now.
Surely you have thoughts about this topic.
This is a great
Now's your
turnout.
chance.
It's a great turnout, though. I do appreciate y'all coming, even if it was for extra credit or for class. I'm glad you guys came.
Well, you've been so quiet for an hour. Okay. All right then. Well, we will conclude then. I would like to thank our panelists for participating in this important discussion. Truly appreciate you taking time out of your busy evenings to be with us. Our last two Constitution events will be held tomorrow. There will be an online discussion at noon on the future of Roe versus Wade and a Supreme Court review panel in the evening here in the Arts and Science Auditorium. You can view LibGuides for more information about tomorrow's events. We have refreshments outside the door here, drinks, cheese, and crackers. And good night and thank you.